The stars above the Virilan Empire did not blink. They watched, silent and cold, as if they had seen all of this before. Somewhere in the void, a human ship drifted off course. It was not a war vessel, not even a scout. Just a simple supply freighter, carrying crates and crates of spare parts, food rations, and quiet dreams. The crew had been laughing when the alarm first sounded. A proximity alert, then silence, then light. Eli Cross opened his eyes to fire. The air smelled of metal and ash. His head throbbed. Something warm was running down his forehead. He tried to sit up, but his arms were bound behind him. Chains. Real chains. Not digital cuffs. He blinked hard. Where am I? Two tall figures stood over him, skin the color of mist, eyes glowing soft blue like frozen moons. They said nothing, only pulled him up and dragged him down a corridor that shimmered with silver walls and floating lights. The ceiling above him moved like water. He couldn't understand the language etched into the panels, but he understood the tone. This was not rescue. He was led into a chamber so vast, the echo of their steps got lost before they reached the other side. The walls glowed gold. Dozens of beings watched from balconies above, dressed in robes that flowed like wind and jewels that sparkled like fireflies. At the center of the room, beneath a domed ceiling lit like a stormy sky, stood a golden throne. Upon it sat a man carved from silence, the emperor of the Virilan Empire. His eyes were harder than the metal beneath Eli's feet. A voice echoed, deep and sharp like a blade drawn from ice. This human crossed into our stars. He is not worth a prison. Shall I feed him to the beasts? Laughter filled the hall. Mocking, cruel, hungry. Eli said nothing. He could barely stay upright. And then a voice, quiet, soft, almost too small to hear, cut through the noise. Give him to me. The room stilled. All heads turned toward a shadow near the edge of the hall. A figure stood alone, smaller than the rest, wrapped in silver cloth, without ornaments, without guards. Her head was lowered, hair like starlight falling across her face. No one seemed to know what to say. Even the emperor blinked in surprise. You want this? I do, she replied, voice barely more than a breath. The emperor laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Fine, take him. A gift for the one who cannot give gifts. At least now you will have someone to talk to. The crowd laughed again. Eli did not, and neither did she. She stepped forward with calm steps, stopping in front of him. She reached out. Her fingers touched his arm, not to grab, not to command, but simply to guide. Come, she said. He didn't understand her words, but he followed. Not because he had a choice, but because in that one moment, her hand was the first thing in this alien world that didn't hurt. As they walked through glowing corridors, Eli's legs barely worked. His vision blurred at the edges. He expected to be thrown into a cell, pushed into darkness. But instead, she led him through a quiet garden filled with floating lights, past statues carved from crystal, into a small room tucked behind a tall curtain. It wasn't a prison, but it wasn't a palace either. The bed was small. The walls were plain. A single candle floated above a table where 2 cups waited, untouched. There were books in strange languages, a vase with withered flowers. It looked more like a memory than a room. You will stay here, she said in broken English. He sat on the floor, his hands still shaking. He stared at her. She did not leave. She simply sat down across from him, folding her legs, watching in silence. Why did you ask for me? He whispered. She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were tired, too tired for someone so young. I don't know, she said. He thought she might be lying, but somehow he believed her. That night he could not sleep. He kept thinking of her voice. Not the words, but the tone, like someone who had never asked for anything before and still expected nothing in return. The walls of her room did not shine. There were no jewels, no silk curtains, no guards at the door. Just smooth gray stone and soft yellow light, like a whisper trapped inside a lantern. The floor was warm beneath his hands. The ceiling was painted with stars, not glowing, just etched by a careful hand long ago. Some had faded. She stood by the far wall, hands folded in front of her, quiet, still, as if waiting for something that might never come. He did not know her name. She had not offered it. He had not asked. Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the wall, arms now free of chains. He had expected a cell. Instead, he was here. Not exactly welcome, but not unwelcome either. The silence was strange, not threatening, not cold, just empty. She brought him food. Not much. A small dish of red fruit that glistened like rubies, and a piece of bread still warm from the oven. She set it on the table and stepped back, watching him from across the room. He looked up slowly. "Thank you," he said. She blinked. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but nothing came. She sat down across from him, her long white hair pooling over her shoulder like snow slipping from a branch. "Why?" he asked. She tilted her head. "Why did you take me?" Her eyes met his. There was something behind them. Not fear, not cruelty. Something older, something worn. "I don't know," she said again. Eli nodded, even though it didn't make sense. That night he lay on the small cot she had pointed him toward. The blanket was thin but clean. The mattress dipped in the middle, as if no one had slept on it in years. She sat by the table, a book open in her hands, though she didn't turn the page once. He watched her for a long time, eyes barely open. "You're not like them," he said. She didn't look up. Why do they treat you like—" He stopped himself. "Like you don't matter?" She closed the book. Her voice was quiet, steady. "Because I can't give them what they want." "What do they want?" "A future." She stood and walked to the window. The night outside was full of floating lights, drifting lazily like silver fireflies. Somewhere in the distance, a tower chimed. The sound was soft, like glass falling through mist. "I cannot bear children," she said. Her words dropped like stones in the air. "To them, that means I am broken." Eli sat up. "That's why they gave me to you. As a punishment?" She didn't answer. Instead, she said, "No one has ever thanked me before." He looked at her. "Then allow me to be the first." She turned slowly, and for the first time he saw it. Not power, not pride, not royalty. Loneliness, wrapped in silk, bound in silence, like him. The next morning he woke to find fresh food on the table. Warm bread, pale honey, a fruit he did not recognize, sliced into neat pieces. She was already there. "Did you sleep well?" she asked. Her English was rough, but clearer. He nodded. "Better than yesterday." She looked relieved, almost imperceptibly. They sat in silence, eating, not speaking, not needing to. Every morning after that, the same ritual. Quiet steps, a plate left on the table, a question asked in a shy, careful voice. She never smiled, but each time she returned, her eyes seemed just a little less sad, and slowly something began to change. Not the palace, not the people, just two lives, pressed close by fate, two strangers, two secrets, and one room, without gold. The palace came alive at night, not with music, not with celebration, but with silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, ancient, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, listening for echoes from a time before crowns and curses. Eli lay in his small bed, staring at the ceiling. The stars carved above him had begun to feel familiar, like old constellations from a forgotten sky. He heard footsteps outside, software, barely there. Not the sharp click of guards, not the shuffle of servants. Then, a whisper. "Come with me." He sat up. She stood at the door, a hood over her hair, her eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. He didn't ask why. He followed. The corridors were darker at this hour. The floating lights dimmed to amber. The guards didn't look at her as they passed, didn't stop her. It was as if she were invisible in her own home. They descended, past corridors made of stone, past doors sealed with silent glyphs, and finally, through a narrow passage hidden behind an old tapestry, they reached a metal door covered in dust. She pressed her hand to it. The door opened without sound. Inside was not what he expected. No throne, no prison, no shrine. Instead, a lab, cold and bright, lit by thin beams of pale blue light that hung like fog. Machines lined the walls. Screens floated midair, displaying codes he had never seen. Test tubes blinked softly beside stone tablets older than language. It smelled of electricity and forgotten hope. "This is my true room," she said. He stepped in slowly. "This is yours?" She nodded. "I built it. No one helped me. No one cared. Why? Because I needed answers." She walked to a console, her fingers dancing over the controls. A soft hum filled the room. A projection lit up above her, three-dimensional, spinning slowly. DNA strands. Her DNA. "I'm not just broken," she said. "I was made to be." Eli stared at the strands. Some of it made sense. Some of it didn't. "What is this pattern?" he asked. She looked up, startled. "You see it?" "Yes," he said. "That's not natural. It's like a lock. Something placed there, to block something else." She froze. "I always thought I was cursed. But if you're right," he stepped closer, "then maybe you're not broken. Maybe you're imprisoned." She sat down hard, as if the truth itself had weight. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My whole life, they said I was born wrong, that my womb was dead, that I was a shadow, a symbol of bad omens." She paused, her hands clenched. "But what if it was all a lie?" "Who would do that?" he asked. She looked up at him. "My father." The room felt colder suddenly. "Why?" "Because of the stars. The priest read my birth sign and saw rebellion. They said I would bring change. My father believed them, so he made sure I never could." She stared at the projection again. Not just a princess, a prisoner of design. Eli stepped beside her. "Then let's find a way to unlock it." She looked at him. For a moment her eyes were not sad, not lost. They were bright, focused, alive. "You'll help me?" "Yes. Why?" "Because I think you're more than what they say you are. And I think I am too." She reached toward the screen. Together their hands touched the light, and the DNA strands shifted, glowing. Outside, the stars were still watching. But now, they had something new to see. The lab felt different now, not because the walls had changed or the air had shifted, but because something between them had. There was a hum in the silence, a quiet momentum that neither of them spoke aloud, but both could feel. Like they had stepped onto a path that could not be undone. Lyra stood by the main console, her back straight, her hands steady. Eli watched her from across the room, checking equipment, rerouting power, reprogramming the interface she had built alone over years of isolation. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with something new, something bright and dangerous and alive. "We can do this," she said. He nodded. They had spent the last 2 days working in near silence, testing samples, rebuilding protocols, comparing human code to Varellan code. And now, they were ready. The machine at the center of the room was a strange fusion of old and new. Varellan crystal technology wrapped in salvaged human biotech. It pulsed softly, casting pale blue light across the floor. Inside it, a vial no larger than a finger. Inside the vial, nanobots, coded in both languages, half Varellan, half human. The key. "This should bypass the lock," Eli said. "Rewrite the block and restore function to the dormant strands." Lyra stared at it. "Are you sure?" "No," he said, "but it's the best we've got." She reached for it, paused, looked at him. "For most of my life," she whispered, "I thought I was cursed, that something inside me was broken. But it wasn't broken. It was hidden, buried, on purpose." She held the vial close. "I want to live, not just exist, not just walk halls that whisper behind me, not just wear titles that mean nothing. I want to live my truth." He stepped closer. "Then let's begin." She rolled up the sleeve of her tunic. Her arm was pale silver, glowing faintly beneath the skin. A symbol shimmered near her wrist, an ancient mark of her house, barely visible in the dim light. He lifted the injector. "Are you ready?" "Yes." She didn't flinch. He pressed the device to her skin. A soft hiss, a flash of gold, then silence. At first, nothing. Then her body jerked, her back arched, her breath caught. Light bloomed across her skin, veins lit with fire, as if her blood had remembered something it had forgotten long ago. She screamed, not in pain, but in release. Her eyes burned bright violet, then everything went dark. Eli called her name. Lyra. Lyra. She didn't answer. He caught her before she hit the floor. She was burning cold and breathing shallow. He laid her on the exam table, wrapped her in thermal cloth, checked her pulse, scanned her vitals. The results flickered, then settled. Stable. And then she opened her eyes, bright, focused, fierce. I feel, she sat up slowly, hands trembling, eyes wide. I feel whole. He didn't speak. He just nodded. But the moment didn't last. Outside the hidden lab, down the long dark corridors, footsteps echoed. Slow, heavy, too precise to be servants, too quiet to be guards. Trouble's coming, Eli said. Lyra looked toward the door. Let them come. Her voice was calm, but her hands were glowing. And somewhere, high above the palace towers, a report was sent. Subject, Lyra Solon. Status, altered directive, immediate containment. The garden above the palace was hidden in plain sight. No guards stood at its entrance. No nobles visited. It was too high, too quiet, too forgotten. But for her, it was the only place that still felt hers. Lyra stepped onto the stone path, her feet almost silent over dew-slick tiles. She passed flowers that bloomed in moonlight, thin petals like folded glass, their glow faint but soft. The vines curled lazily up the arches, trembling in the breeze like they were listening. She didn't wear royal colors, just white, simple, clean, no crown, no guards, only hope. Eli waited near the far edge, standing beneath a silver tree whose leaves sparkled like stars. He wore a robe she had left for him, woven with thin threads of light, soft over his bandaged skin. He still moved carefully, his sides stiff from exhaustion and days of working nonstop in the lab. But when he saw her, he smiled. Not wide, not bright, but real. She walked to him in silence. I've been dreaming, she said quietly. About? A future where I'm not a burden, where I'm not hidden, where I'm more. She looked up at him. Where I am a mother. Eli's breath caught. You deserve that future. They stood close now, close enough to feel the space between them pull tight like thread. You're not afraid, he asked. Always, but not of this. She looked up at the night sky. Twin moons shone above them, caught in slow orbit like dancers refusing to touch. They gave you to me as a joke, she whispered. He looked at her. I know, but you were never a joke, Eli. You were a key. He touched her hand. So were you. And then, without a plan, without permission, without the need for either, she leaned in and kissed him. It was not desperate. It was not rushed. It was the kind of kiss that said everything else could wait. That said, I see you. That said, stay. When they parted, the silence between them felt warmer than any fire. And far below, on the edge of the garden, in the shadows cast by pillars older than memory, two guards stood watching. They said nothing, only turned and walked away. The throne must be informed. Lyra took a breath and held it, eyes closed, her forehead resting gently against Eli's. It's too late to run, he said. She nodded. Then we face it together. That night, the stars above the Virilan Empire shone a little brighter. But in the palace below, the storm had already begun to move. The golden chamber had never been this silent. Even the air felt heavier, like it knew something sacred was about to be broken. Eli stood between two guards, his wrists in steel cuffs. The metal was too tight. His back ached from being pushed to his knees. But his eyes never left her. Lyra. She stood tall at the center of the chamber, surrounded by nobles and priests in the cold glow of power. Her white robe shimmered beneath the lights. No crown on her head, no fear in her eyes. She did not bow. At the far end, seated upon a throne carved from meteorite and adorned with symbols of lineage and war, sat the emperor. Her father. He said nothing at first. only looked at her like she was a ghost he thought long buried. "You were seen," he said at last. "With the human." The words fell like iron. "Do you deny it?" Lyra looked around the room, faces filled with judgment, with hunger, with expectation. She lifted her chin. "I do not." A ripple of gas spread through the court. The emperor rose slowly, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut sharper than any blade. "You let the human touch you?" Eli tensed. He could barely breathe, but Lyra didn't blink. "Yes," she said. "I chose him." The chamber erupted, voices shouting, priests cursing, nobles raising objections. One of the guards beside Eli took a step back in disgust. The other just stared at the floor. The emperor raised his hand. Silence returned like a curtain dropping. "You are my daughter," he said. "You carry royal blood. And yet you disgrace it with this creature?" She looked at Eli, then back to her father. "He is more noble than anyone in this room." The emperor stepped down from the throne, his robes dragging like storm clouds. "I should crush him where he kneels." Eli lifted his head, his voice quiet but firm. "You already tried. When you gave me to her, you thought you were casting her aside. But instead of destroying her, you gave her someone who listened." The emperor's lips curled in rage. He raised his hand. Lyra stepped forward. "I'm pregnant." The world stopped. Even the candles seemed to freeze. The emperor's hand fell to his side. "What did you say?" Lyra's voice did not shake. "I'm pregnant, and it is his child." A priest dropped his staff. A noble gasped. Princess Ayla, the sister who had always stood in shadow judgment, took a step back, her face pale. The emperor stared at Lyra like she had spoken a prophecy. "Impossible," he whispered. "You are barren." "No," she said, "you cursed me. But I broke your chains." The silence was absolute. Then an old voice spoke. There was a prophecy. An ancient priest, skin wrinkled like stone, stepped forward with slow reverence. A union between stars and earth, a child of two worlds, one who will bring change. The emperor growled. "That prophecy is forbidden." "Yet here she stands," the priest said, "carrying the air of two galaxies." Lyra turned to Eli, and though her hands were trembling, she reached for his. "Whatever happens, I'm not afraid anymore." He gripped her hand tight. "Neither am I." The emperor looked at them both for a long, still moment. Then he turned and walked out. But in his silence, his fury boiled. Outside the chamber, in the black halls of his private command, he called forth the only ones he still trusted, the Shadow Guard, and he gave a single, whispered command. "Before that child is born, make sure neither of them survives the night." The palace slept with its eyes open. Guards patrolled the upper halls. Servants whispered behind closed doors. Somewhere in the lower levels, torches burned without flames, casting moving shadows where there were no bodies. But in the royal wing, silence moved like a knife. Lyra sat beside Eli, holding his hand. His wrists were no longer in chains, but his wounds still ached, wrapped in glowing bandages that pulsed softly with heat. She hadn't spoken much since the trial. Neither had he. There was nothing to say that words could hold. "He will come for us," she said finally. "He cannot let us live." Eli nodded. "Then we run." She shook her head. "There's nowhere to go. Not while he rules." For a moment there was nothing but their breathing. Then, click, click, click. Footsteps. Too soft for soldiers, too smooth for servants. Lyra's breath caught. "They're here." Eli stood, grabbing the nearest object. A piece of broken lamp metal. No blade, no shield, but enough to fight. The door burst open. The first dagger missed his face by inches, embedding in the wall behind him. 3 figures stepped inside. Their robes were black, their faces masked in silver, their movements silent as smoke. "You should not exist," one said in a voice like rusted wire. "The king sends his farewell." Eli didn't wait. He charged. The first strike met his makeshift weapon with a flash of sparks. The rod snapped in half. Pain shot up his arm. He twisted, slammed his shoulder into the assassin, drove them back but not down. Another came from behind, toward Lyra. "Number," Eli shouted. But before he could move, A pulse of energy exploded from her hands. The second assassin flew backward, slammed into the wall, dropped. Even Eli froze. "You can do that?" She was shaking, her breath rapid. "I didn't know, until now." The third assassin lunged. Lyra dodged, her movements sharp and precise. She raised her hands again, but the glow faltered, too tired, too soon. The blade rose toward her throat, and then a shot, loud, clean, final. The assassin dropped. Eli turned, wide-eyed. Princess Ayla stood in the doorway, breathing hard, a blaster in her hand. Lyra gasped. "Why would you help us?" Ayla stepped forward, face unreadable. "Don't misunderstand me, little sister. I still hate you, but killing a pregnant heir, that would destroy the Empire. I may be cruel, but I'm not a fool." Behind her, guards rushed in. The assassins were dragged out, their bodies limp. Their mission failed. Ayla turned and walked away without another word. Eli collapsed to his knees. His side was bleeding. Fast. Lyra dropped beside him, her hands pressing against the wound. "Stay with me." He coughed. "Still here." Her tears fell onto his chest. "You're bleeding too fast." But he didn't answer. That night the palace did not shake from battle. It shook from fear, because everyone had heard the rumors. And now they were true. The king had tried to kill his own daughter, and failed. Again. Morning rose behind a veil of clouds. But the sun was not needed, not today. Light came from somewhere else. From voices rising outside the palace walls. From hands held together across class and blood. From something ancient being undone, and something new being born. Inside the palace, tension hummed like a wire pulled too tight. The corridors were lined with silent guards. The great hall stood empty. All had been ordered out. The king stood alone. His hands trembled as he held the crown. It no longer felt like power. It felt like punishment. The doors opened with a deep, echoing creak. He expected soldiers, rebels, chaos. Instead, he saw her. Lyra. She wore robes of white and gold. Her hair flowed like a banner behind her. Her steps were slow, not from fear, but from purpose. Eli walked beside her, his face pale, his wounds healing, but his posture tall. Together they entered the throne room without flinching. "I'm not here for revenge," Lyra said, her voice steady. "Then why?" the king asked, his voice dry as ash. "To end this, not with blood, but with truth." Eli stepped forward. He held up a crystal orb. It shimmered, then projected images into the air. The king's voice, his orders. "Make sure neither survives the night." The entire court watched, because they had all come. The high priests, the nobles, the guards, the people. Word had spread like wildfire, and no wall could hold them back anymore. The recording ended. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was heavy, final. The king dropped the crown. It hit the marble floor with a sound like thunder. "I was afraid," he whispered, "that she would rise above me, that they would love her more than they loved me." He looked at Lyra. "And they do." Lyra stepped forward. She picked up the crown, but she did not place it on her head. Instead, she held it out, away from herself, toward the people. "I do not rule because of blood. I stand here because I chose love over fear. Because this human, who was given to me as a joke, gave me the greatest gift of all. Hope." The crowd roared. The priests raised their hands. One stepped forward. "By the law of the stars, a new queen rises." The nobles bowed. The guards knelt. Even the king fell to his knees. Days later, celebration swept across the empire. For the first time in history, humans and Viralans stood side by side, on balconies and streets, beneath banners of silver and white. Lyra and Eli stood at the highest tower, hand in hand. Below them, chants echoed, "Long live the queen, long live the heir." The unborn child, half alien, half human, was already legend. Lyra turned to Eli. "Do you think we're ready for this?" He smiled. "We were born for it." And so began the reign of a queen not born of conquest, but of courage. Not crowned by blood, but by choice. A daughter once cursed, a human once forgotten, a child yet to be born, already carrying the weight of two worlds. But the story is not over. Now I ask you, If love could change an empire, what could it change in our world? Leave a comment below. Tell us, would you choose safety or truth? Obedience or love? And don't forget to subscribe for more tales that prove humanity isn't just a species, it's a force. HFY Obsession will return.